Welcome everyone to Vancouver Rape Relief's 2020 Montreal Massacre Memorial. This year we're hosting a series of 12 online events. You can find the full program on our website at rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. We're live on Facebook and on Zoom for today's event, Race, Class, and Male Violence Against Women, Part 2. Last week we heard from Julie Diesta of the Committee of Domestic Workers and Caregivers' Rights, Trisha Bapti of Exploited Voices Now Educating, and my fellow collective member Ashani of Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. Today we have 4 speakers that will be making the connections between race, class, and male violence against women. Joining us is Faye Blaney from the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, Suzanne Jay from the Asian Women Coalition for Equality, and Taina Bien Aimé of the Coalition Against the Trafficking of Women, as well as my fellow collective member, Danny from Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. So to start us off, I just want to remind everyone that we would like you to introduce yourself, your work, and how from your work with and behalf of women, on behalf of women, how you see the elements of race and class impacting women's experiences of male violence. So to start, we can have Taina.
Hi, everybody. I guess I'm the lucky starter. It's such an honor and pleasure to be with you today and everybody in online land, wherever you are. I hope you are safe and healthy and sheltering in peace. So I work for the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which is one of the oldest organizations globally that works, as the title states, on ending trafficking in women and girls, and also in ending the sex trade, including prostitution. We are, what makes us unique, because there are many anti-trafficking organizations, is that we look at the issue as cause and consequences of gender-based violence and discrimination. So I am based in New York City, where we're very small, but we have small offices in the Philippines and Mexico. So we are a global organization. And basically what we do fits into 3 buckets. So we don't provide direct services. We are a legal advocacy organization, and we work at a legal and policy level at the local, state, federal, and international level. So I work a lot with the United Nations. And we raise awareness, because even though we feel like we are gaining rights legally, we are losing in the culture war when it comes to violence against women, and certainly on the issues of prostitution and commodification and sexualization of women for male pleasure and corporate profit. And then of course we work with survivor leaders. Many of our partners are survivor leaders from around the world. And so that's just the introduction. I'm also a founding board member of Equality Now, which was formed in 1992. And so I was a board member for 8 years until I became its executive director. So all in all, I spent 20 years at Equality Now, which is an international human rights organization that focuses on all forms of violence and discrimination against women and girls, as well through legal advocacy. And I don't know if you want me to say more than that, or that's just the introduction, and I can talk about the work a little more.
If you want to go ahead and give us a bit of an idea of how you see race and class impacting women's experiences of violence and prostitution and being in the sex trade from your perspective of the work that you do.
Sure. So, it's always good to start from a personal point of view. So I am a first-generation American. My parents are immigrants from Haiti, a small island in the Caribbean. So when we talk about race and the legacy of the institutions of slavery and colonialism and imperialism, my parents' island. It started in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus, when Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was the first lands that Christopher Columbus and his men invaded. And the first thing he did was to rape the women and prostitute them. And that is documented. The women were described as, naked objects that were just too free and that needed to be tamed. And then, of course, being an African American, you expand not just the invasion, but also the trafficking of human beings from 1619, when from that point for 400 years, Europeans brought 12 million Africans, not just here in the United States, but across the Americas and elsewhere. And so how is that relevant now to our work is that we see that there's a direct line between the rape, the prostitution, the exploitation, the use of women as sexual currency, right? Professor Orlando Patterson from Harvard talks about the compounded abuse and exploitation that enslaved women faced because they were sexual currency. So the women were through rapes and forced pregnancies, they were actually, even after slavery ended officially in the mid-19th century, it was the African women on not just in the American soil, but across the Americas, who were the perpetuation of enslaved human beings. And I always like to tell this story of that Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate for literature, a lioness, American writer, who talks about reading in the slave narratives where this one pregnant enslaved woman had violated whatever rules of the plantation, but she was pregnant, and so in order to protect the future property of the plantation owner, he dug a hole so that she could put the belly in the hole so that he could whip her back without jeopardizing his future property. And so now when you see what is happening around the conversations around the sex trade, right? It's kind of the descendants of these people, I have to say. And I could go more into details, more specifics, but when we work at the United Nations and we see what the agencies are promoting, they're promoting migration for what they call sex work, not a term we use. These are the same governments that have enslaved human beings for 400 years. But that's part of the narrative, I think, that we don't talk a lot about. So now in the United States, a lot of people are talking about the legacy of the institutions of slavery, but nobody's really talking about the institutions of misogyny and how they were embedded in those institutions of enslavement and oppression, and sort of the added burden that women and girls have faced because they were female, and because of the added value of their bodies to the profitable lines of the corporate world, basically. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, I'll ask you to elaborate more later, and thank you for making the connections, of course, between the history of colonization and women's overrepresentation, Black women's overrepresentation in prostitution today. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that from Suzanne and Faye as well. Next, if we can hear from Suzanne about the work that you do and how you see race and class impacting women's experiences of male violence from your point of view.
So I'm with a group called Asian Women for Equality. I and a group of us, founded this organization. We've gone through a couple of different names, but what we are now is we're focused on raising the status of Asian women, both here in Canada and hopefully by doing that in Canada, making it possible for Asian women to, aligning ourselves with Asian women in our countries of origin and other Asian countries. We founded ourselves, we invented ourselves about 15 years ago. We came together originally in response to a couple of different very public attacks on Asian women that took place in public spaces. One was an attack on a Korean woman who was jogging through Stanley Park by a man who was a complete stranger to her, and he beat her until he paralyzed her. She survived the attack, but now lives as a paraplegic. And the story that came out of that was warnings to women about, not going into the park, not jogging by yourself, not doing any kind of activity that without some sort of male escort. And then a couple of weeks later, a young Burnaby woman named Amanda, another Asian woman, she was reported missing after she went out for a walk by herself after dinner. And again, we had to push back on the fear-mongering about Asian women being targeted. And it wasn't because we were trying to say Asian women aren't targeted. We are for male violence, but all of the attention was focused on what we were doing rather than focusing on the men who decided that we were fair game. So we realized by doing that it was really important to be seen by other Asian women as fighting back. Because by doing that, we give each other a bit of bravery, we give each other some permission, we make it possible for ourselves, we're organizing, and we make it possible for other women to organize. So that was a great experience. But a few months later, we learned that the youth wing of the Young Liberal Party of Canada was getting ready to bring forward a proposal at their national convention to decriminalize sex buyers. So that was something that emerged over 15 years ago, that was in play at least 15 years ago. And so that's something I wanted to point out, is that this campaign to legalize male sex buying started a long time ago and was initiated by men who are now no longer youth, no longer part of the youth wing, but are actually part of the party itself, holders of actual real power within the party. So my organization has, as a strictly volunteer organization of Asian women who are representative of Vietnamese, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and Filipino and other Asian communities, we have appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada to bring up the perspective and experience of Asian women in relation to prostitution. And we were invited as interveners on a case called Bedford, where the court struck down laws that required the Parliament of Canada to decide whether or not they actually wanted to regulate or have any kind of legislation around prostitution. And we then we're invited to appear before the parliamentary and Senate committees to in the passage of the law. So we are responsible for helping to decriminalize women who are prostituted and maintain and actually reinforce the fact that, and understanding that the men who participate in prostitution, they're the source of the harm. They're the source of the demand, and they're the ones who should be the focus of any kind of criminal justice attention. So our current, in talking about what are the intersections of race and class and violence against women, if I have a little bit more time, I think I still can keep talking. Is that right? Okay. So I thought I'd just give a bit of an example. It's an American example, but how it affects Asian women is that we are hyper visible in prostitution. We're but invisible at the same time, and very disposable in the sense that we're almost interchangeable. Trisha Bhatti last week, I think she was trying to articulate her understanding of this experience of being interchangeable. And when she was trying to describe, a man can call an agency and say, I want a 5'3" Korean girl who's really petite. And really, the agency can send any old Asian woman out, and as long as she's sort of close to that height, the man's imagination and demand for that racist experience of sexism, which is prostitution, fills in all the gaps. So just very quickly, the example I wanted to bring up to illustrate this intersection of is the one of Robert Kraft. You'll remember he's the billionaire who owns the American football team, the New England Patriots. So he was arrested in a police operation that was investigating an Asian-themed day spa where men were getting massages, but mostly going there for hand jobs and blow jobs. And when the police actually, the first time that Robert Kraft went, his car was pulled over by the police, because whoever was driving was speeding. Robert Kraft engaged in a conversation with the police officers and told them that he was the owner of the New England Patriots. He had a very friendly conversation with them. He knew that he'd been caught coming out of it. You would think that he knew that he was caught. He knew he was being kind of caught, noticed coming out of an Asian massage parlor, but he went back the next day. He had no sense of threat from those police officers or being noticed, being involved in that activity. But when he was arrested, 25 other men were arrested. His case, the fight that he mounted, is highly publicized, and he has actually been acquitted now. The story for the other 25 men is that they got plea deals, misdemeanor plea deal. They were charged with misdemeanors. They had the option to pay a fine and do some community service, get some STD testing, and take a class on what they did, that would teach them about how wrong what they did was. The women, however, faced much more severe consequences. 4 of them were arrested. 2 of them faced between 27 and 28 charges and could face 15 years in jail each. Their bail was set at about $280,000 each. All of their assets were frozen. And their pictures were distributed all over their national media. And these are women who are 58, 43. They're not young enough to be sympathetic. Anyway, that was the example I wanted to give, is that the men, I'd say that because Robert Kraft beat his charges, he's actually elevated as a result of that experience. The women are hyper hyper visible, but also completely invisible. As far as we know, no one is helping them. I'll close there for now and pass. Have things, I'd like to hear from Faye now.
Yeah, Faye, if you can give us your comments on the work that you do and how race and class impact women's experiences of male violence.
So I just wanted to thank Vancouver Rape Relief for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. And I especially wanted to do a territorial welcome or an acknowledgement at a minimum. I think that the theft of our homelands and of our resources was the very first act of genocide, and we still live with that genocide today. So acknowledging the occupation of our lands is really important. I wanted to talk a bit about the Aboriginal Women's Action Network. We started in 1995 and we've been going since. And we don't really have a staff or office space. We don't really have funding. We've occasionally gotten funding to do research, but we've gone way above and beyond what the dollar amount expected of us. We started because there were 3 Indigenous women in very high profile positions that were fired with impunity, like they had no recourse. And then that was from 2 different organizations. And then there was another group of 9 women that were fired from a counseling agency because they were organizing to unionize. They were trying to find ways to address the lateral violence that was being perpetrated against them. And so the organization fired them all, and the union wasn't all that helpful. These women went through the court process, and 2 of them were reinstated, but we worked alongside those women as much as we could, and we developed an alliance at that time in 1995 with the Vancouver Status of Women, and they provided us with space to meet and to talk. And that was quite an incredible experience to have that space, to be able to share openly as we did. And promptly, as any consciousness raising group works, we went to action, trying to develop strategies on how to address the issues that the women in the group were being confronted with. So that's the history of how AWON was formed. We've done 2 huge participatory action research projects. The first one was on Bill C-31, and it was kind of funny in a way, funny in my mind, that the non-Native women were asking us, why are you doing that? Haven't we already resolved that issue? And it was really difficult to articulate how when you are successful in a legal proceeding, that the implementation process is highly problematic. And there were so many women across the land that continued to experience discrimination and abuse and violence in various ways. And so we did that project, and it really pulled a lot of women together from all around the province. Our second project was when the state was trying to download its responsibilities in the justice system to communities with a tiny little portion of funding that the justice system would receive, and we really fought against it for K files, or violence against women files, at women and children. And so in that project, we rafted down the Fraser River as part of the World March of Women 2000, the March Against Poverty and Violence. And we held 4 focus groups and 5 rallies along the way. And it was an incredible experience, and the magnitude, the depth and breadth of violence that Indigenous women were experiencing was so overwhelming. And I think inside of A1, we kind of imploded ourselves because we were also um, experiencing the same thing that they were telling us. And it just was so difficult to process. And we didn't have the resources or the ability to process what we were hearing and what we were reliving. So at this point, I just wanted to share a little bit about my own experience, and some of it you can find in the film called Finding Dawn from the National Film Board. Um, the sexual violence that I experienced, I think it started at the age of 3. That's my earliest memory of it. And it continued throughout my childhood. I ran away when I was 13. At various points, I was sent to residential school where I experienced the same things there. I was sexually assaulted, I think, when I was about 12. And that kind of violence in my life continued throughout. And when I was running away in my own community, um, my experience was identical to what my mother went through. My dad drowned when I was 4 years old, and she was 23 with 4 children. The men in the village were raping her. The women or the wives were beating on her because they claimed that she was stealing their husbands. And when I was running away, my aunties were out gunning for me because they were accusing me of luring my uncles into having sex with me. So that's what I was running away from when I was very young. And in the end, what I found was that I was a refugee in my own homelands. I couldn't really go home. And I was what they called an urban Indian at that point. I lived in Vancouver. And from all my experiences, I noticed that in a very angry way that we had no voice as Indigenous women to defend ourselves in any kind of violence that was being leveled against us. When we disclosed, we were shut down. I had an auntie who was thrown out of a window in the downtown east side in the early 50s before I was born. And she was sexually assaulted. The guy was in jail in Ocala, one of the rare occasions when men are held accountable for sexual assault, for raping women. And she didn't last very long. She was killed by the time she was 16, my grandaunt. So I guess my point in sharing my personal story is that it also is what I struggle for. You know, the very things that I've lived, I'm trying to make a difference for other women so that they don't have to experience what I went through. And it's very discouraging. The genocide is real, and I continue to see my sisters being impacted by the very same things that I survived. And in fact, as you mentioned earlier, Mackenzie was at an event this morning speaking, and what happened there was that an Indigenous woman was raped in the downtown east side in broad daylight. And a year ago, another Indigenous woman gave birth in that area, and the baby died. And so it says loud and clear that the bullseye is still on our foreheads as Indigenous women. The attack hasn't subsided in any way, shape, or form. And you would think that in this day and age of the national inquiry, that things would have dramatically changed. But I really have a hard time seeing any changes happening with the inquiry. When we began, the issue that I had was that they were starting off on this footing of the family's first agenda. And in my opinion and in my experience, the family was the source of the violence and the abuse that I went through. And so I couldn't support a family's first agenda. And I totally respect women like Maisie Ojik or Bernie Williams, these women that Myrna LaPlante, that are family members that have struggled on behalf of their family members. But it's not okay to erase us, the rest of us that have no attachment to families. And yet that persists. We have a federal government that's developing a national action plan. It's delayed, their plan is delayed, they say, due to COVID, but they do have these tables that are at play at the moment. And one of those tables is a family group. Now that's a slap in the face, if nothing else, for me. There is no table for Indigenous women. The other tables that they have are First Nations table, Métis table, Inuit table, and an urban table, and then there's other ones. But in the First Nations table, which is the one that I would fit under, they have the women chiefs that are sitting at that table. And I think anyone here can make the argument that just because you're a woman, it does not mean that you're coming to the table representing women's interests. And when you're a chief, your interests are much broader than just the women in your community. And that assumes that Indigenous women have a voice to be able to say what's happening to them in the communities. On my reserve, there are which is where I'm living right now, there are gang rapes still going on, and those women are filled with shame. They're not going to come forward and say anything about what's happening to them. And at the start of the national inquiry, when I saw that the chiefs were having such a huge role, I looked on the internet to see the rates of sexual assaults being perpetrated by chiefs. And just in that one Google search, I came up with nine cases. And that's staggering for me. So are those chiefs going to represent my interests? I think not. And anyway, we come from a history of being socialized into patriarchy. I hope I'm not making a beeline here or uh, deviating from what I'm supposed to be talking about here. In the Indian Act, with the colonizers, they made huge efforts to socialize us into a patriarchal model. So we have our matriarchy being replaced with a patriarchy. We have matrilocal residences being replaced with patrilocal residences. So what I mean by that is that Indigenous women under a matriarchal tradition would have lived together. And my aunties talked to me about that, in the sense that grandmothers, mothers, daughters all lived together. And they explained to me the kinship system amongst the children, that they were all brothers and sisters. And my auntie said to me that her brothers would go off and live in the community of their wives, and their children would be cousins, which is different than, your sister's children. And women being displaced from that arrangement to being forced to live in men's reserves that are foreign to them has done an incredible job of disrupting our culture and our traditions. And the political exclusion that happened, and the religious imposition of male leadership, has really had an impact, to the point where women chiefs are few and far between. We still are so far behind. So I cannot, in any sense, support this system that the federal government has imposed of having First Nations women chiefs representing my interests in this national action plan to address the violence against us. And the other challenge or issue of racism, I guess, that I wanted to talk about is the sense of entitlement of racists to take up all the space. And, you know, in terms of violence, the ones that were impacted by the most are the police and the justice system. But we're also impacted by social workers, by fisheries and conservation officers, clerks and cashiers, truck drivers, and other pimps and johns, by doctors and nurses in the most recent report that's just come out. And but in terms of the sexual violence, we know that there are police officers that have sexually assaulted, that have raped Indigenous women and have gotten away with it. And we know of a case here in Prince George where that act was being perpetrated by a judge. And so I guess where I want to end off with is to say that there is a collusion between patriarchs in our world, in our Indigenous world. We have Indigenous men that are not willing to give up power and control, and we have the non-Native patriarchs in the justice system, the political arena, healthcare, wherever. Those non-Native patriarchs support the Indigenous men to have power and control, to have domination over Indigenous women. And I am really hopeful of the new generation of the young people. In spite of what I've just said, I'm hopeful. In today's CBC news, they printed a story about a young man from the Squamish Nation, Kelsimuth, who is bringing forward a resolution to the Assembly of First Nations to look at the violence. I can't remember the exact language of it, but they want to examine the violence within the organization. And that's a good place to start. I mean, looking at what they do within the organization itself is helpful. Some of you will remember that during the national inquiry, I was challenging them, even though they were making the claim that they had a lot of Indigenous women working there. And my point is, yeah, they might be working there, but they don't have power and control. They don't set the tone and the direction of the organization like anywhere else. And so just to close off, I guess the point I want to close off with is that A1 is really, really, really concerned about the issue of prostitution, because we feel like the progressive or even the feminist world out there have turned against us. They are trying to pretend that they're the ones that are standing with women that are prostituted to advance their interests. But what we see is such large numbers of Indigenous women that are being prostituted, that are at survival prostitution, that have their children apprehended, that are caught in cycles of addiction and homelessness, human suffering galore. And we think we can do better for those Indigenous women. And that's what A1 is trying to do. So that's where I want to conclude. Thank you.
Thanks, Faye. We appreciate so much your work organizing with Indigenous women as women only against male violence, because of all the things that you've said, and the importance of independent women's organizing. And yeah, you're not only echoing what Taina and Suzanne said about how prostitution is profoundly sexist and racist, but also what other panelists have said throughout our Montreal Massacre Memorial event. And in order, to imagine a world where women of color, Indigenous women, can be free, we will have to abolish prostitution. So yeah, more comments about our frontline work from Danny.
Hi, so I'm Danny. I'm a crisis worker and collective member of Vancouver Rape Relief. As a rape crisis center and transition house, we respond to around 100 women and their children who have been battered, raped, incested, harassed, or are currently in or have exited prostitution. And my relationship with Rape Relief started back in 2017 when I first moved to Canada in a short-term visa. At that time, I was a child activity volunteer for the kids staying in the transition house, so the women could have a break to fill up papers or meet their teams for peer counseling, or really sometimes just have a break. I'm originally from Brazil, which is a very racist and violent country, especially for women. And for us outsiders looking to Canada from our third world home country, you can easily think that women's oppression here is somehow lighter and that this country is far from being racist and intolerant. So I personally appreciate very much that we are able to host this event and the part one as well, and everything that we've been hosting the past few days. And I really hope that tonight and the part one as well, we're able to expose the systematically problem that racism and sexism is. And I hope this conversation can reach people everywhere, really. So when we talk about male violence against women, we know that men are attacking women from every race and every class, everywhere. But being an Indigenous woman and a Black woman, a woman of color, can make you more vulnerable and targeted to certain attacks, and can definitely add barriers to when you're trying to survive, resist, and be free from the abuse, from the violence. We've recently released our own stat about women of color we serve, and we've been talking a lot about them. We know that 72% of women who stay in our transition house are women of color and Indigenous women. 78% of them live in poverty, and 18% of them working low-paid jobs. And we do know that income instability is a huge factor when we talk about male violence against women in whatever shape that will be. If we talk about intimate partner violence, we know that women are either fully responsible for caring for the kids in the house, so can't work outside the home, or in a lot of situations, men prohibit or manipulate women not to work outside the house. We know of men that take the income assistance check this woman receive, and men that give this woman just enough money to pay the weekly groceries for the house. Some men use the woman's addiction, which majority of time is to cope with past experiences of male violence and or the current one, to keep them trapped in the relationship while they're feeding them drugs. Men know very well that financial independence means greater chances of women leaving them. And if children are involved, that makes the decision even harder for a woman to make. You're not only worrying about having a roof over your head, but you want to make sure you have food for you and your kids. You want to make sure that you are going to be able to bring them to school. You want to make sure that they will have a winter coat. A lot of women keep putting up with abuse out of fear of not being able to provide for their children. Fear of the system taking them away, either because that has happened to them before, or because they've seen way too many cases like that, especially if you are an Indigenous woman in Canada. We know that 52% of children in foster care are Indigenous, despite accounting for 7.7% of all Canadian children in the age of 0 to 14. And we also know that Black children are overrepresented in care at 5 times their representation in the population. We get calls from women trying to find a safe space for them and their children, but we also get calls from women needing a safe space to go and revealing how much they want to try and get their kids back. And a lot of them are using drugs and alcohol to cope with a lifetime of violence and abuse. If we talk about sexual harassment in the workplace, we get calls from young South Asian women new to Canada with little English, little money, and bills to pay, telling us that their bosses brought them to their apartments instead of the place that they're supposed to do cleaning, and then sexually assaulted them. Now, we are talking about women that can't tell their families back home that this happened to them because they risk to be blamed and ashamed more than their daily self-blame. And these men know that the limited language, the traditional and sexist culture, the lack of knowledge about the resources this new country can offer makes it very unlikely this woman will ever try to either hold them accountable. And these men know that sometimes women won't even leave the job. We get calls from Indigenous women entering predominantly male work fields like construction and facing the intersection between racism and sexism. White men will constantly harass these women with racist stereotypes, clearly trying to humiliate them and make them leave the jobs that they were executing better than many of them and sparking rage. We know that these men will make sexist jokes, even show them pornography in the middle of the work. In general, men have this based on reality sense of impunity. And now prostitution, we host a panel, 2 parts, part 1, part 2 on prostitution, international feminist overview on prostitution, so that we talked a lot about that in the past few days. And from our work, while we know that while Indigenous women are only 3% of all women in Metro Vancouver, they make up 27% of women in prostitution who call our lines. And while Black women are only 1.2% of all women in Metro Vancouver, they make up 14% of the women in prostitution calling us. This data reflects the intersection between racism and sexism in prostitution. While all women are vulnerable to male violence, the rate of racialized women victimization is even greater. I want to mention that nearly half of the women in prostitution who call us are trying to exit prostitution. High numbers of women who are no longer in prostitution are still vulnerable to male violence. They call us seeking safety from current abusive male partners, or sometimes from Jones who still threat and harass them. And to repeat what my fellow collective member Ashani said on the part 1 of this conversation around race and class and male violence, women of color, Indigenous women are more likely to be in street prostitution and therefore at increased rate of assault and violence. Any analysis of women who are in prostitution that does not acknowledge the compounding effect of race and class on the condition of women's lives is privileged, apathetic, careless, and dangerous. We also work with a lot of racialized immigrant women, and the barriers are several. These women sometimes follow their husbands to Canada after the men become a permanent resident or a citizen, and we know that men often are more qualified for visas and jobs due to easier access to education and money. These women believe Canada will offer them a better life. Sometimes it's monetarily, sometimes it's a matter of being free of the restrict sexist traditions of their own home country, and sometimes it's both. These women believe that in Canada, their husbands won't be violent no more, that men here will be held accountable. But while these women are on a permanent residence process, they will tell the cops that sometimes were called by the neighbors that they are fine and that nothing happened. They will meet with us and not move to our transition house because they fear that their husbands will withdraw the sponsorship and they will need to be sent back home, and sometimes sent home to face poverty, sometimes to face backlash from their family for leaving their husbands. And these abusers use the fact that these women are completely isolated for being new to the country, not having any family member besides them, and for not speaking the language. And these men purposely keep them from learning the language to prevent the woman from building a new community here and have more chances of seeing herself living without him. Women sometimes come to Canada in search for a better life for her and her children back home. and end up trapped with the violence and emotional abuse men put them through, because these men are providing for her children back home. And even when women decide to leave their abusers, they see themselves with a Canadian kid with no possibility of going home with the baby because the fathers are Canadian and most likely would apply for a not removal order. Or sometimes the woman wants to stay here because she won't be able to provide a fair life for her children in their home countries due to poverty, due to violence. These women have no status, and that means that they have almost zero access to resources. These women don't have access to child tax benefits, to income assistance, to public health care. These women are on the margins. Daycares have long waiting lists, but even if they didn't have, the women have zero source of income. And we know that daycares could cost $1,300 per month. We're lucky we are able to rely heavily on community support. Women volunteering to watch our residents' kids while they're filling up tons of forms for their immigration claim. Watch the kids so they can start learning English and be prepared to enter the work field once they have a visa. We have women volunteering hours towards translating meetings, calls, letters, emotional support. And these women, these immigrant women, know that those are the barriers they will face when they leave. And so leaving their abusers can feel impossible. Women need to have the autonomy to make real decisions at the time she wants. And we are talking about women deciding to leave abusive partners. We are talking about women deciding to leave jobs where their boss is sexually harassing them. We're also talking about women not having to self-represent in court when the legal aid hours run out, while their ex-partners can afford lawyers for as long as they need to. So we are talking about autonomy to make real decisions without seeing all those barriers and thinking that it might be impossible for them.
Thanks, Danny. I'm getting a lot of appreciations in the chat for Faye. And Florence is saying, Faye, you connect the personal with the political brilliantly, as always. And from another woman, and she continues to carry on the fight. How do you do it, Faye? Always appreciate your words. Much gratitude, sister. And many more, as well as to all the panelists so far. From Suze, thank you to Suzanne, Faye, Yakima, and Taina. It's like listening to my herstory, and Danny, listening to you. I continue to understand how much work is left, and I'm hopeful to see this panel being broadly represented by women who are the most unrepresented, probably. So I think what we'll do.
We have a question for Suzanne.
Next, we have a question for Suzanne. Is there any data on Asian women in prostitution in Canada?
No, not anything that you will find from Statistics Canada. That's definitely not something that Stats Canada is tracking. It's not something that the RCMP or police forces anywhere in Canada are really tracking. Maybe we did a bit of a study ourselves a few years ago where we just looked at Vancouver, and we looked at Craigslist in Vancouver for Metro Vancouver, because Craigslist was really active at the time at facilitating prostitution. And so the stats that we got from that, were really telling. So we looked at a 24-hour period of ads selling sexual sex. We captured, I think it was 1,475 ads, and then we looked at half of them to get as a oversampling. And we found that over 65% of the ads featured or described Asian women for sale. So that's one example. Another one that you might be able to extrapolate from is a case a few years ago where the police in Montreal, they busted prostitution ring, a human trafficking ring. It was only 7 people. It was one of many many kinds of so-called like busts for human trafficking in Eastern Canada, at least for that year. So this is just one group of not super competent human traffickers. The police said that potentially they had, these 7 guys had trafficked up to 500 women from the east coast of Canada through all the major cities, and then sort of just push the women from province to province, and then out through BC. So one gang of 7, 500 women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you're saying speaks to what you were saying earlier too about Asian women in prostitution being invisible, because we know that Asian women are often in massage parlors and brothels, which means that they're kind of out of sight and also in a legal gray area that people don't even consider to be prostitution. So in that way, it can be hard to kind of, and no one is counting women in prostitution because by and large, it's not considered violence against women. So I just wanted to say that because Taina is on the East Coast, she will be leaving us in a few minutes. So what I'll do is I'll ask a question from the audience and give Taina the opportunity to answer first, so we can hear some more comments from her before she has to go. So my question is, what institutional policies and practice are in place currently that exacerbate the race, class, and sex inequalities of the women that you are working with?
So that is, it's a very complicated question, and I appreciate it. But first, I just wanted to acknowledge Faye. Faye, we've never met. I've never heard you speak. I just honor your survival. It's just so moving to hear, the unbelievable suffering that you and your sisters have endured and survived. And really what you're describing, even though it is extremely personal, but it is so generalized around the world and taking so many forms, that we are talking about forms of femicide. And I'm not using this term lightly. There are scientists that have looked at sort of the evolution of human species. And as we know, there were many, many species before the Homo sapiens kind of survived among all the species. And the Homo sapiens killed the other Homo sapiens. They killed them all. And I always say that if we did not give birth, we would have also been, women and girls would have also been absolutely destroyed. I mean, if you just look at, again, I work globally. I've worked all my life on all forms of harmful cultural practices and violence, different forms of violence, depending on the culture of the environment. And if you look at how the Taliban deal with their women, where women can't sing, they can't speak in public, they can't show their ankles or their wrists. Were it not for the fact that they were creators of the next generation, they would have been entirely annihilated. And this isn't hyperbole. I mean, I see when we talk about institutions, obviously it's the stories of the survivors, it's our work, our collective work on the ground at the grassroots on working on ending violence against women that has to rise up to the institutional level. And that in fact is the struggle, right? So I had talked earlier about working at the United Nations level, and people, the average person doesn't necessarily understand, or the United Nations is not something that you think about on a daily basis, but it's an incredibly important body, because if it didn't exist, we would have to create it, right? It's just a body where you've got 190 plus governments who come together and decide what international standards need to be in place and ratified, and they decide that they agree in theory that they are going to be held accountable to implementing all of these international laws. And of course, there are laws that pertain to women and girls' rights, like like CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the Palermo Protocol when it comes to trafficking, the 1949 Convention. And so when governments get together, including the Canadian government, what they do is they come back home, and whatever is decided at the UN influences national policies, right? It influences the development of national indicators. It influences the investments that governments make in terms of research. It influences states in terms of their national laws and policies. And so we see that when it comes to women and girls, first of all, the agencies that deal with women and girls are few and far between, right? You have UN Women, and they're very, very under-resourced within the UN family. But in our field, what we are seeing is that an incredible number of UN agencies, for instance, the International Labor Organization, the World Health Organization, UNFPA, which deals with development, UNAIDS, I mean, the list goes on, all promote prostitution as work. And so what does that mean? It means that we are in constant struggle with agencies, and who also, they're supposed to not only abide by international law, but they're also funded by governments. And so, and I'll just give you a very concrete example, since we are talking about sort of the effects of colonialism. So let's take the Netherlands, right? So the Netherlands has legalized prostitution in the early 2000s. They believe it's a job like any other. They legalized prostitution because they believe they could monitor the violence. They could address the organized criminal networks that they were seeing were involved in the sex trade. And the women would register with the government so that the women could obviously, well, first of all, pay taxes, which makes the state a pimp, but also go and complain to the police should a sex buyer rape them or sodomize them or not fulfill the original contract, so to speak, between the woman and the sex buyer for that sexual act that was negotiated. But you look at the Netherlands' role in slavery, for instance. So they, and this is just a very brief historical overview, they landed in Cape Town in South Africa in the mid-17th century, and then there was a population there, the Khoi Khoi, and like many indigenous populations, it was very difficult for them to enslave them, so they proceeded to massacre them, but then they needed labor, right? So what did they do? They started trafficking and enslaving people from other parts of Africa. When you see the way they promote prostitution within very formal environments, like testifying before the CEDAW committee, for instance, or elsewhere, asking governments to create safe passages for migration for the most vulnerable, the poorest women in the global South, to come to Europe for the sex trade. There's one line between what happened in Cape Town in the 16th century and what is happening in 2020 within the UN situation. So all that is, and then how do we address it? Because I see one of the questions is, what can we offer as systems of hope, like as messages of hope? We believe that the only way we can fight this, because I'm a lawyer by training, and people kind of tune out when you talk about the laws, et cetera, but it has to be the voices of survivors. It has to be that we uplift help organize, support the leadership of survivors. There's a growing global movement of prostitution survivors, of sex trafficking, of sex trade survivors who speak the truth, you know, or survivors of sexual violence. Even though, and like Canada, Canada is a country, one of the 8 countries that have enacted what is known as the Nordic model, or now the equality model. I know you have certain exceptions in your law, but 7 countries have followed Sweden from the 1999 law that decriminalizes only people in prostitution, like the women in prostitution, provides them services and invest in exit strategies if people are ready to leave the sex trade, while holding the perpetrators accountable, including the sex buyers, right? So 7 countries have followed Sweden. No countries have followed New Zealand, which has the whole decriminalization system, right? So in New Zealand, so decriminalization is a worse form of legalization in that the government just washes its hands altogether. They have no idea how many brothels there are. They have no idea what the prostituted population is. We know from a number of reports that there is an exponential increase in New Zealand of trafficking, particularly of Asian women who are trafficked in New Zealand. But what the federal government has said is let the local counselors and let the local municipalities deal with it. So from a legal perspective, we feel that we are advancing, but where we are losing is in the cultural narrative and the political narrative, right? So Faye was talking about progressives just totally participating. You know, you have Black Lives Matter that has a platform calling for decriminalization of pimping. The Women's March in the US calling for decriminalization of pimping. There is a recent initiative here in the United States called the Survivors Agenda, of which what there are 4 leading women's rights activists who and social justice activists who started Survivors Agenda, even though they claim that it's not a women's movement, who just issued 2 months ago a platform that includes decriminalization of the sex trade, including pimping, brothel keeping, and sex buying. And then we have the Justice Democrats here in the US, the Democratic Socialists of America, which are a very popular political movement now. One of the requirements, if you want to be endorsed by DSA, well, especially I'm going to speak for DSA New York, I'm not sure that all the chapters of DSA require this, you have to pass the litmus test. You have to literally check on a box saying that you are for the decriminalization of quote unquote sex work. So, you know, what we are seeing, like, how can we combat that, right? When the media is totally in cahoots with the pro-prostitution camp, when we have politicians who, and social justice activists, Black women, women of color who either follow the patriarchy, right? Or they're too fearful to speak up because then you are, you know, it's a lot of personal attacks, you are discredited, you are isolated. I mean, I'm sure that you in Canada know what that means, and here it is the same. And so there are some days where you just think we have not seen the peak of this, and where will this lead? But I do think that the tipping point is and will continue to be the voices of sex trade survivors. But there is a cognitive dissonance that is happening that I personally don't know how to break. Me personally, I mean, as part of this movement, where finally, I mean, if you look at the last 50 years of the women's movement, of obviously the last 50 years that have been built from the last 17 millennia, but we finally recognized that domestic violence was a crime, right? Because when I was growing up, domestic violence was just a bad marriage, right? So if you went to complain about your husband battering you either had the priest reminding you and you know, till death do you part, or you had the police who came and asked the husband to take a walk around the block and calm down. The same with sexual violence, your skirt was too short, etc. So we're finally, and now with the Me Too movement, we're finally understanding a little bit sort of the lifelong negative impact of one perpetrator against one victim, right? What male violence, the dehumanization of women, the humiliation, the sexual harassment, the sexual violence, what that does to a woman throughout her life. But somehow, if he gives her $50 for that same sexual violence, sexual harassment, dehumanization, and really femicidal activity, then it's empowerment and consent.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not understand why there is such a cognitive dissonance, and I'm speaking particularly among people who should, who claim to be in the progressive movement, who claim to understand equality, who claim to understand what dignity means for human beings. So that is the dilemma in which we are in. It is a very difficult situation. I think we can all agree. But again, I think we have to believe in the tipping point, and maybe there's some more brave journalists out there who will break the story and speak the truth. And the other thing I'll just finish up is we have to follow the money, right? So a lot of the organizations that I was just mentioning depend highly on funding. And so there are a number of foundations whose main goal, or one of their very distinct and explicit goals, is to support the global movement to decriminalize pimping. And you know, it goes back to the colonial mindset, is that it is a moneymaker. We are talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that is the sex trade. What we don't talk about is, you know, when some UN agencies estimate very, very modestly that the profits from sex trafficking reach $100 billion a year. So we can imagine that would probably be triple that amount once we recognize what prostitution is and how pervasive it is. What people don't talk about is that every single one of those $1 billion come from sex buyers. Mm-hmm. And the sex buyers are the most invisible equation in the discussion around prostitution. And so once we start naming the violence, once we start naming the source of the profits, we can, you know, we have to shock the public into empowering them to hold their own governments accountable to what in effect is femicide.
Yeah, Johns and sex buyers are still able to hide in the shadows, and so much of the conversation around prostitution is focused on the women, when really it's the men who are harming the women that should be focused on. Yeah, we've been close to the Coalition Against Trafficking of Women for many, many years. The Vancouver Rape Relief has, so it's really great to have you on our panel today, Taina, and I know it's very late in New York, so we'll let you go, and I'm sure we'll be reconnecting at some point in the future soon.
It's a great honor. Thank you so much. Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Vancouver Rape Relief. Happy holidays, and stay healthy.
Yeah. So Taina explored more the connection between violence against women and prostitution that we've been talking about today, as well as throughout the 10 days of our panel so far. I'm wondering if there's something in particular that she said that Faye and Suzanne wanted to respond to, and Danny? If not, we can go back to our original question about institutional policies and practices that are in place that exacerbate the race, class, and sex inequality of women that you're working with?
I guess throughout the whole, I think we're in the 10th day of the 12 series event that we've been hosting, and we had 2 parts on prostitution, this international feminist overview, and we also had a panel about the response to women during COVID times. And really, I guess, things that it's like we've been repeating things for a very long time, like years and years. So it's basically the same old demands that feminists have been doing the past few decades, which is first, like, guarantee livable income. For sure, we were talking about like how income instability is like fully connected to how vulnerable woman is to male violence against women. And we can talk about also the housing crisis. And Hila also mentioned when she was on the panel for about our response to women during COVID, about rent control, for example, or even Ashani on the part 1 of the same race, class, and male violence against women. She was mentioning how sometimes MCFD, for example, set up a plan for the woman to close her file, and each kid of that woman, say in our transition house, needs to bring there to daycare or preschool for a different amount of time. So she's having to like transit all over the place, picking her kids up in different times. And so for sure, free public transportation, because we know that it's so expensive. So even basic things such as like public transportation. So and for sure, universal childcare, because again, we were talking about waiting lists that are just ridiculous. And even the problem, I think, right now is just not even just the waiting list, is the fact that a woman, to be able to put her kid in a daycare, she needs to spend like minimum of like $1,000 per month. And then when you talk about immigration, Julie Diesta talked a lot about like landing status, and also status for all the workers that are here right now, all the students and everything. We know that women that we work with have no access to a lot of things while they don't have a visa. And we do know that, for example, refugee claimers, they can access, once they apply for their refugee claim, they can access the interim health care system. But we know that if you were applying for a humanitarian compassion ground, you can have the interim health care. So really, we know that a lot of women that have no status have access to very little resources. And we were this morning again in the rally organized by the Pacific Association of Indigenous Women, and Mackenzie Jordan was speaking there, and they were calling for, and we've been repeating in the past 10 days as well, about like detoxing and treatment centers on demand right away, because we do know that a lot of women are wanting to get clean and go to treatment, and in a lot of situations there is no detox beds available, there's no treatment available. And we know that from our experience that sometimes it's a very, very short window that the woman is actually ready to give that step. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that needs to be done, and that puts women in a more vulnerable position, and in a more having more trouble to actually be free of violence and abuse and poverty and everything.
And even though we've been calling for all of these demands for many, many years, we are seeing from our frontline work that women are in even more of an economically desperate situation than they ever have been, which has definitely been made worse by the pandemic, as well as rent prices continue to skyrocket, and there's been no significant increase in welfare rates. And, you know, we are supporting women all the time who are looking to rent market housing while on welfare, and it's near impossible to be able to find a place.
I think the flip side of the same coin that you're speaking of is this system of capitalism and free trade that's happened. I remember in the 90s, we were fighting against the free trade agreements, and corporations have way too much power across the continent and around the world, and they're able to extract resources so readily, and we're in an environmental crisis right now. And in my homelands, we have fish farms, and my brother is the chief, and he's just been negotiating for weeks, trying to come to some kind of a resolution to attempt to make the same gains that our neighbors to the north have made in their fight with the fish farms. And then we have the state questioning our right to, how strong is your right to this area or that area. And this whole argument around land use and occupancy is so frustrating because they confined us to reserve, and now they're trying to blame us for not utilizing those lands and those resources. And it wasn't until 1951 that we were able to leave the reserves without their permission. But I just think that the wealthiest in the world are getting wealthier, and it's way out of control, and the Donald Trumps of the world have taken over, and in that world we don't count and we don't matter. That was my one thought, was that capitalism as a system is a huge problem. You know, we talk about poverty, but the other side of that equation is the capitalist structure. And just in terms of Indigenous women, I think the institution that causes way more grief than anything else is the child welfare system. They steal our children, and those Indigenous moms are more likely to become addicts of some sort, that they get into high risk behaviors because their life has no more meaning. And the children that are going into the child welfare system, the girls, the representative for children and families put out a report in 2016 telling us the rampant rates of sexual abuse of Indigenous girls in the child welfare system. And then we have reports of those women aging out, girls aging out and becoming young women, and how they're ending up in a vacuum. Like they end up on the streets, homeless, or are forced into prostitution. Like there's just a world of grief that's created by the child welfare system, and there's some talk at higher levels of changing that system, but again, we have the problem of Indigenous women not having an adequate and effective voice in that process. And the chiefs are making decisions in areas that don't matter a whole lot because we mirror the larger society. In our communities, what takes precedence and what is privileged is the capitalist structure. We have economic development goals, you know, ranking way up there, and child welfare concerns and male violence against women being a much lower priority. So that's my view. I mean, the obvious one, of course, is the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk more about the criminal justice system as well. I think what we've also seen from Indigenous women across Canada is how, you know, mining companies and other resource extraction companies that move into areas also means that there's man camps and increases of violence against women as women are pushed into prostitution. And so that, I think, very much ties into your criticism of capitalism and how that impacts Indigenous women in particular. And from our frontline work, we're also seeing, you know, still how much women who have just aged out of foster care tell us about their experiences of violence at the hands of their foster parents or people connected to the foster family that are not their biological parents, even though they were supposedly protected by being in foster care from their own families. Suzanne, do you have anything more that you'd like to add?
Yeah, just quite a lot, because so much has been said and there's so many things to respond to and build on. But I'll start by picking up some of the threads around that Taina and both Faye have both addressed, which is capitalism. And I'd like to just say a little bit about how there is actual capitalism as you've described, but also that we're living in a context where the ideology and culture of capitalism is so profound that it shapes all of our perceptions. Taina pointed out that the act of giving a woman a bit of money after having attacked her somehow transforms that interaction from one of violence into one of commerce. And that is something that we have to find a way to battle. And how do we do that when it is actually our culture? There's a couple of other pieces. So responding to the question about institutional policies, I'd like to go back again, as you've addressed, what Julie Diesta was talking about, how, we've been fighting for landed status upon arrival for women who arrive here as workers, and also my group also demands landed status for women who arrive here under exploitative circumstances, which of course includes being a domestic worker or a care provider. But one of the reasons why that particular avenue is so important is because it's one of the only ways for a woman to arrive here, to immigrate to Canada independently, to be here not as a wife, not as a daughter, and not as somebody who's wealthy enough to be in the investor class. I can't remember how much you have to invest now. I know it's over $250,000 in order to sort of gain more points or gain status upon more quickly. Another piece that is how we keep women criminalized. We're working on a project to help women with criminal record suspensions. And, what happened is Canada adopted an equality model of law towards prostitution, which has been described. But one of the major failings of that law, there's many major failings, but one of the major failings of that law is that no one thought, we didn't manage to fight hard enough and win the suspension of the records, of the criminal records of the women who were caught up in that net. And so women who have criminal records for what we now acknowledge as being criminal records for being exploited, criminal records for being poor, criminal records for being sexualized and racialized. Those women are left with those records, and their lives have been completely affected by them. And there's no actually easy, accessible way for them to change that. Danny has mentioned basic income. And I would say that this is about women's enforced poverty. So not only the poverty that women have to deal with when they're on welfare, but the poverty that's enforced on us when we get old. Canada Pension Plan, the old age money, doesn't really take into account that women live longer. It does notice, but doesn't account for the fact that women get less money as workers. And so not only, so that poverty is that poverty is acknowledged but not addressed. At the very local level, I'd say the institutional policies that we're fighting that affect women, in particular Asian women, is the fact that city councils across Canada give business licenses to pimps. They let pimps open up businesses in neighborhoods of all different economic at all economic levels, and they let men buy women in storefronts in broad daylight. And they consider it, you know, I don't know that they would do that if racialized, if there wasn't a language barrier, if there wasn't a culture of believing that Asian women are naturally suited to prostitution. And that's compounded by the fact that another institution, the police, mostly refuse to investigate any kind of male violence against women. And if they don't investigate male violence against women, then they're definitely not going to investigate prostitution, which they don't yet consider to be violence at all. And I guess I'll just wind up with talking about one of the other, it's not a policy exactly, but it's definitely a culture among academics to promote and protect the facilitators of prostitution, and to describe Asian women in particular as using the term migrant sex worker. And that is just that's just a boon to human traffickers and pimps. That they have the academics on their side, convincing and building, you know, creating knowledge and evidence that they can use to basically falsely portray Asian women as eager participants in our exploitation. So.
Yeah, I think it was echoed before about how academia and universities very much push the narrative of sex work being a choice and are hugely influential in our culture, where this idea is gaining more and more ground, as we heard from Taina as well. Rachel is commenting in the chat in response to your comments on women being more poor as pensioners, and she's saying that OAS and GIS combined still means that the elderly are living in poverty, even more so for elderly women. And yeah, Stats Canada is confirming this and saying that women are more likely to live in poverty in old age, yet there's nothing that's being done to address this. And I'm also getting another comment about how you know, the NDP proposed that people have more than $20 billion should pay a 1% tax cut, but neither the Liberal nor the Conservative Party supported that. So I think that's very telling as to who the two major political parties in Canada are actually representing and working for. So I would like to hear some final words from all of you, because we're quite far into the panel, and if you're, we haven't had a chance to talk yet about holding abusive men accountable via the sexist and racist criminal justice system. So if you want to add some more thoughts on that, as we haven't had a chance to talk about that, or what it's like for women whose communities are protecting their attackers and what can be changed around that, that would be really instructive.
Yeah, I know that we had, I think it was when we were doing the first part of the panel around prostitution, Hila was saying, how we definitely need to have an event where we talk more about what accountability means exactly, and about the current criminal justice system. And so I know that we will have a more in-depth conversation around that. Yeah, so for me, in relation to the criminal justice system and the work that we've been doing on our crisis line, we know that the criminal justice system, it's not the answer and the solution against male violence against women the way it is. Violence against women is perpetrated by men of every race and class, but the jails are still disproportionately filled with Native men, Black men, and poor men. And these men are not in jail because they committed violence against women. Men rarely are held accountable for the sexist violence they commit against women, and especially sexual violence against women. According with Statistics Canada, only 1 in 5 cases of sexual assault reported to police in Canada results with a trial, and only half of the cases that goes to trial results in conviction. So basically 90% of sexual assault cases that women reported to the police would end up in nothing. Police crown the criminal justice system as a whole fails women of every race and class. It is not designed to protect us. Even in cases where Crown approves charges, the woman usually share with us on our crisis line feelings of extreme alienation, like she's not part of the story, even though it happened to her and she's the one dealing with the trauma in a daily basis. During the process that can take years, sometimes 3, sometimes if there's an appeal, even way more than that. Women experience dismissiveness and lack of empathy. The police and crowd talk to them as the attack. She was not there, she was not present to that. Talk about the violence, the violation that was not in her body. We heard from women that they felt intimidated by Crown from the beginning because they will share stories of having to arrest women because towards the end of the process, again, 3 years long process, the woman didn't want once more to be victimized and cross-examined because all they wanted was just to move on with their lives after 3 years of process. The criminal justice system is designed to criminalize Indigenous people, Black people, and people of color, and further marginalize them. We know that Indigenous women represent 4% of the population in Canada and 42% of incarcerated women. Again, we will definitely have a more in-depth conversation about that, but we definitely want rapists, betters' names to be public. We want them to be shamed. We want them losing their jobs and access to women. We want men to know that their acts will have repercussion. And right now, men know that they can abuse and hurt women because nothing will even happen to them. But again, I think I'm looking forward to have like a more in-depth conversation about that for sure, because that was brought up a few times throughout our series of events.
Yeah, thanks. I think we're all too familiar with the failings of the criminal justice system and who it's actually working for, which is not women. Any final comments from Faye or Suzanne as we get close to our 2-hour mark?
I will say something about what we do in this community. It was one of the issues, one of the things that I took issue with in the national inquiry was this push to have more healing programs to heal the men, which is total nonsense in my mind. First of all, there's this Western notion of healing without taking into account the larger picture of the community. But beyond healing, I think there has to be a critical analysis of what's going on. And in one of the healing workshops that I participated in here on my reserve, the facilitator began to tell us, paint a picture of colonization and I interrupted them and I said, listen, we know all that stuff. We already know what has been done to us. And what we need is more anti-racism education. Well, I don't know if it's education or legal remedies, but something has to give in terms of the oppressors. It's the oppressors that are at fault. In Campbell River here, the racism is so intense, and the healthcare system is so bad. We should have centralized them in the report that just came out this past week on racism in the healthcare system. So many anecdotes that I can share around mistreatment of our people by the healthcare professionals. And so, you know, we can talk till the cows come home about how we're being victimized by the criminal justice system, but at the end of the day, they're not changing. You know, they have an attitude of a sense of entitlement. They continue to do what they're doing, and I don't know what big stick we can wave to get them to shift what they're doing. The fact that the police feel entitled to Indigenous women's bodies, the fact that prison guards feel entitled to Indigenous women's bodies, the fact that, you know, the judge in Prince George felt entitled to an Indigenous girl's body. You know, I don't know where it stops, and we have male power within our communities that feel entitled to access Indigenous women's bodies, and I just don't know what the big stick is. Sometimes I think when we educate racists, they become better equipped to challenge us, and so maybe the answer is legal remedies. But I also know how they stonewall us in terms of legal remedies. We've taken so many court cases forward on Aboriginal rights and title, and the victories have resulted in zero implementation on the part of the government. And it's insane what the government is able to get away with in terms of not applying their own laws. So I don't know, is there another way to bring about change besides those two, educating racists, anti-racism education, or is it legal instruments that they don't apply anyway, like the VPD with the prostitution law? I mean, that's my discouragement coming out loud and clear, I think.
Yeah, I think that that is always the big question. We don't have answers yet about alternative models to the legal instruments that we have that actually result in men being held accountable and men knowing that they shouldn't harm women. And you're right that we have to be very critical in seeing what kind of alternative models are being put forward and who they end up actually serving. Suzanne.
Not quite sure anymore what to say. I don't want to be too discouraged. I think right now we should. I think it's really important to take really seriously the movement across North America right now to defund the police. I think that's a really important thing to notice, a really important fight to reinforce. I don't agree with, you know, getting rid, like, I don't think we're able right now to not have police. I think we're not able. Oh, my battery's running low, so I might just disappear. But we're sort of at a fork in the road right now in terms of, do we give the police more money or not? And I think it's really kind of logical that we're in this position right now, because our social services are so eroded. Our expectations of our social services are so eroded. That we can't even imagine often what they should look like. And they've been eroded in the context of increasing a reliance and emphasis on a law and order agenda. So it's no surprise that when we say, let's defund the police, there's panic. And it becomes a yes or no question. The police should be asking to be defunded. They should be asking for less money so that more money can flow to the supports that will make it possible for them to actually do their jobs. And the types of, to do the kind of policing we want them to do. Right now we're giving them lots of, we're militarizing them. Vancouver, one of the things that Vancouver is trying to get funding for, if they don't have it already, is to get drones. They have a drone program. So I don't, that obviously is not, they haven't really demonstrated how that type of technology will actually make women safer or threaten violent men more effectively. I'd like to see that case, that particular business case. But yeah, I think I started out by saying that we are definitely at some kind of, I hope, some sort of tipping point about funding police, about giving the police more power with less responsibility almost, or less accountability, I mean. Giving them more power with less accountability. That's exactly what they're asking for. And we get to decide now. This is an interesting and important moment.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. It's absolutely outrageous that the VPD is asking for more money and is doing so little actually right now to protect women, keep women safe, and hold men accountable. And we know that those extra funds are not going to actually make any difference in being able to protect women more, because what they need is to have the political will to hold men accountable and not more funding for, toys, drones, and all those types of military equipment. So yeah, I think it's clear that we have an analysis of race and class and how that relates to women's oppression and violence against women, and also some ideas of concrete reforms in shifts in how the public is thinking about different policies or how we're funding the police. And Vancouver Rape Relief and the Asian Women Coalition and AWON is working on some strategies to press the provincial government to make some significant changes. And we'll be calling on the men and women who support us to join in on those strategies. So stay tuned, everybody who is in the audience today. And thank you so much to Suzanne and Faye.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I just want to say one thing. Is just based on what you said, Sophia, I really don't want to I think, pressuring government is important, but I think independent organizing and like making community is even more important, just as important. What do you think, Faye?
Well,
I mean, we
definitely
waste all of our time writing letters and lobbying, but really, we need to put energy into walking the talk.
Yeah, I really echo what you're saying, because giving a shout out to Rape Relief for this the series that you've had over these 2 weeks. At the National Inquiry, I was calling for more support for autonomous Indigenous women's groups, and this is working in that direction. And I really hope that my AWON sisters are online tonight and watching this, because we are organizing our own educationals to do consciousness raising awareness about those systems of oppression. I think that's how we're going to move forward, is by working within our own communities, as we do with you at Rape Relief. And I really appreciate that kind of alliance that really works for me, and that's where I get my hope, is doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I think that during the pandemic has been really hard on women, women's mental health, women's resources, and also on women's organizing. So we definitely need to find ways to continue to work together and build community by doing panels like this, and to organizing more ways of connecting into the future and doing more conversations like this. I appreciate again all the comments and thoughts and the preparation for the panel. And for everyone who is watching, we have 2 more events in our 12-day speaking program. So tomorrow we have They're Always Telling Me I'm Too Angry, poetry reading and conversation with Christos at 2 p.m. And you can watch live on Facebook or join on Zoom. For all the details and for the Zoom link to each event, you can visit our website, rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. And for now, we will see you tomorrow.
Thank you so very much, Sophia.
Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you, Danny.
Thank you, woman.
Yes.
And thanks to everyone in the audience.